My counselor said I was seeking attention. Then they found me unconscious in my dorm. The first thing I remember after waking up was the oxygen mask, not the beeping monitors or the IV in my arm or my mother crying in the corner of the hospital room. Just the mask, pressing against my face, forcing cold air into my lungs with each breath. I tried to pull it off, and a nurse I didn't recognize gently pushed my hand back down. She was saying something, but the words sounded underwater, distorted and far away. My head felt like it was packed with cotton, my thoughts moving through sludge. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten here. Couldn't remember anything after sitting at my desk in my dorm room, trying to finish an essay that was already 3 days late. The nurse leaned closer, her voice finally breaking through the fog. "You're at County General Hospital. You were found unconscious in your dormitory. You've been exposed to carbon monoxide. Do you understand?" I didn't understand. Carbon monoxide poisoning happened to people with faulty furnaces in their basements, to families who fell asleep with their cars running in closed garages. It didn't happen to college freshmen living in a campus dormitory that was supposed to be safe, that had passed all its inspections, that charged $35,000 a year for the privilege of living there. But apparently it did happen, because according to the monitors I was hooked up to, my carboxyhemoglobin levels had been at 38% when the paramedics found me. Anything above 25% was considered severe poisoning. Above 40% was often fatal. I'd been 90 minutes away from dying on my dorm room floor, while Dr. Beverly Stanton, the campus counselor I'd been seeing for 6 weeks, sat in her comfortable office, convinced I was just an attention-seeking freshman who couldn't handle the stress of college. I'd started at Whitmore University in August, one of 1,500 freshmen moving into the residence halls for the start of fall semester. Whitmore was a mid-sized private university in the Midwest, known for its engineering program and its beautiful historic campus. I'd been excited to go there, had chosen it over 3 other schools because of their strong computer science department and the scholarship they'd offered. My parents had driven me up from home, helped me move into Marshall Hall, a 4-story brick dormitory that had been built in 1962 and housed about 200 students. My roommate was a guy named Liam Chen, a quiet engineering major from California who spent most of his time either in class or at his girlfriend's apartment off campus. We got along fine, mostly because we barely saw each other. The room itself was typical college dorm, 2 twin beds, 2 desks, 2 dressers, a small shared closet. The heating was controlled by a single radiator under the window that clanked and hissed, but seemed to work well enough. The first few weeks were normal. Classes were harder than high school, but manageable. I made friends with some guys on my floor, joined the computer science club, went to parties on the weekends. I called my parents every Sunday to assure them I was fine, eating enough, getting sleep, not partying too hard. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be for a college freshman. Then, in mid-September, I started feeling off. It was subtle at first, just this persistent tiredness that didn't go away no matter how much I slept. I'd wake up feeling exhausted, drag myself through classes fighting to keep my eyes open, come back to my room and collapse for a nap, then wake up still tired. I figured it was just my body adjusting to the new schedule, to staying up later, to the dining hall food. Everyone said freshman year was exhausting. This was normal. But the tiredness kept getting worse, and other symptoms started piling on. Headaches that throbbed behind my eyes and wouldn't respond to ibuprofen. Nausea that came in waves, especially in the mornings. Dizziness when I stood up too fast. I started having trouble concentrating in class, the professor's words sliding past my brain without sticking. My grades started slipping. Assignments I'd normally finish easily taking twice as long because I couldn't focus. I went to the campus health center in late September, thinking maybe I had mono or some other virus going around. The nurse practitioner there, a woman named Linda Okonkwo with 20 years of experience in college health, examined me thoroughly. She took my vitals, which were all normal. She ran blood tests that came back showing nothing unusual. No infection, no anemia, no obvious medical cause for my symptoms. When I described the fatigue, the headaches, the difficulty concentrating, she asked about my stress levels. Was I feeling overwhelmed by coursework? Having trouble adjusting to being away from home? Experiencing anxiety about grades or social situations? I told her honestly that yes, college was stressful, but I didn't think that explained how sick I felt. I'd been stressed before during finals in high school, during SATs, and I'd never felt like this. This was different. This was physical. She nodded sympathetically and explained that sometimes our bodies express emotional stress through physical symptoms. It was called somatization, completely real and not something I was making up, but the root cause was psychological rather than medical. She recommended I make an appointment with the campus counseling center to talk to someone about stress management and adjustment issues. In the meantime, she prescribed me a multivitamin and suggested I work on sleep hygiene, regular exercise, healthy eating. Standard college wellness advice. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I made an appointment with campus counseling because I didn't know what else to do. The health center said there was nothing physically wrong with me, so maybe they were right, and this was stress. Maybe I just needed to talk to someone and learn some coping strategies, and I'd start feeling better. The counseling center was located in the Student Services Building, a newer construction with lots of windows and inspirational posters about mental health awareness. I checked in at the front desk and waited in a lobby with comfortable chairs and a white noise machine that was probably meant to be soothing, but just made me more anxious. After 15 minutes, a woman emerged from one of the offices and called my name. Dr. Beverly Stanton was in her early 50s, dressed professionally in slacks and a cardigan, her graying hair cut short. She had a warm smile and a friendly demeanor as she led me back to her office, which was decorated with plants and calming nature photos. She gestured for me to sit in a chair across from her desk and settled into her own chair with a notepad. "So," she said, "what brings you in today?" I explained everything. The exhaustion, the headaches, the nausea, the trouble concentrating. How it had started a few weeks into the semester and just kept getting worse. How the health center had run tests and found nothing, had suggested I might be dealing with stress. I told her I'd never had problems with anxiety before, had always been pretty level-headed, but maybe college was different. Maybe I wasn't handling it as well as I thought. Dr. Stanton listened and took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. How was I sleeping? Was I eating regularly? Did I have friends? A support system? Was I feeling homesick? Worried about grades? Having conflicts with my roommate? I answered everything as honestly as I could. Sleep was okay when I could fall asleep, though I'd been having weird dreams lately. Eating was harder because I felt nauseous a lot, but I was trying. I had friends, though I'd been seeing them less because I was so tired. I wasn't particularly homesick. Grades were slipping, but that was because I couldn't concentrate, which made me worried about grades, which probably made the stress worse. Liam and I got along fine, barely saw each other. When I finished, Dr. Stanton set down her pen and gave me that warm, understanding smile. What you're describing is very common for first-year students. The transition to college is one of the most stressful life changes a person can go through. You're away from your family and your familiar support systems for the first time. The academic demands are higher than what you're used to. You're surrounded by new people and trying to figure out where you fit. All of that creates a tremendous amount of psychological pressure, even if you don't consciously feel anxious. She continued, explaining that sometimes stress manifests physically before we recognize it emotionally. The body keeps score, she said, using a phrase I'd later learn was from a famous book about trauma. My headaches, my fatigue, my concentration issues, they were all classic symptoms of anxiety and adjustment disorder. The fact that the medical tests came back normal supported this diagnosis. There wasn't anything physically wrong with me. My body was just expressing the emotional strain I was under. It made sense when she said it like that, with such certainty and professional authority. She had a PhD in counseling psychology, had been working with college students for 15 years. If she said this was normal adjustment stress, who was I to argue? She recommended I start coming to weekly counseling sessions to work on stress management and develop better coping strategies. We'd do some cognitive behavioral therapy to address anxious thoughts, some mindfulness exercises to help with the physical symptoms. She also suggested I consider talking to a psychiatrist about anti-anxiety medication if the symptoms didn't improve, though she wanted to try therapy first, before jumping to pharmaceuticals. I left that first session feeling oddly relieved. There was a name for what I was experiencing. Adjustment disorder with anxiety. It was treatable. I wasn't dying of some mysterious illness. I just needed to learn how to manage stress better. I started seeing Dr. Stanton weekly, every Wednesday afternoon. We talked about my classes, my social life, my relationship with my parents. She taught me breathing exercises and progressive muscle relaxation. She had me keep a thought journal to identify negative thinking patterns. I tried everything she suggested, genuinely wanted to get better, but I didn't get better. I got worse. By October, the headaches were constant, a dull pressure that occasionally spiked into stabbing pain behind my left eye. I was sleeping 10, 12 hours a day and still waking up exhausted. My nausea had gotten bad enough that I was skipping meals, surviving on crackers and ginger ale because anything else made me feel like I'd throw up. I'd lost 9 pounds in 3 weeks. My hands trembled when I tried to take notes in class. I'd have these episodes where my vision would blur and my thoughts would scatter, and I'd forget what I was doing mid-sentence. I told Dr. Stanton all of this during our sessions. She'd listen, make notes, and then gently remind me that anxiety could cause all of these symptoms. The weight loss was probably from the nausea, which was caused by stress. The trembling was adrenaline. The cognitive issues were due to my anxious thoughts consuming so much mental energy that I didn't have capacity left for focus. She asked if I was doing my breathing exercises. Was I challenging my negative thoughts like we'd practiced? Was I getting enough exercise, enough social interaction? I admitted I wasn't doing the exercises as much as I should. It was hard to remember when I felt so awful, hard to care about breathing techniques when my head was pounding and I felt like I might pass out. She made a note on her pad, and I saw her expression shift slightly. Not anger, but something like disappointment. She asked, very carefully, if I'd been feeling depressed. Was I having thoughts of self-harm? I said no, which was true. I wasn't depressed or suicidal. I was just sick. She wrote something else down. Over the next few sessions, I started to realize that Dr. Stanton didn't believe my symptoms were as severe as I was reporting. She'd use phrases like, "You're catastrophizing your physical sensations," or "You're hyper-focused on normal bodily functions." When I told her I'd nearly fainted in my biology lecture, she suggested I might be hyperventilating due to anxiety and interpreting the resulting lightheadedness as something more serious. When I said I'd thrown up 3 times in 1 week, she asked if I might have developed a fear of vomiting that was actually causing the nausea through a feedback loop of anxiety. Every symptom I reported was reframed as evidence of my anxiety disorder, proof that my mind was creating or exaggerating physical problems. I started to feel crazy. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was blowing everything out of proportion. Maybe the symptoms weren't as bad as they felt, and I was just being weak, unable to handle normal college stress that everyone else managed just fine. But then I'd stand up and the room would spin, and I'd have to grab onto something to keep from falling, and that felt pretty fucking real. I went back to the health center in mid-October, hoping someone there would take me seriously. I saw a different nurse practitioner this time, a young guy named Kevin Ruiz, who was fresh out of his training program. I described my worsening symptoms, the weight loss, the constant headaches, the episodes of confusion and dizziness. He pulled up my chart from the previous visit, saw the normal blood work, saw the referral to counseling. He asked if I'd been seeing the counselor regularly. I said yes, every week. He asked if the counseling was helping. I said no, I was getting worse. He nodded slowly and explained that sometimes anxiety takes a while to respond to therapy. It could take months to see improvement. In the meantime, he could prescribe me something for the nausea and the headaches. He wrote scripts for ondansetron for nausea and a stronger NSAID for headaches, then suggested I talk to Dr. Stanton about the possibility of starting an SSRI for anxiety. If my symptoms were this severe and not responding to therapy alone, medication might help. I took the prescriptions to the campus pharmacy, filled them, started taking them. The ondansetron helped with the nausea somewhat. The NSAID didn't touch the headaches. I mentioned the medication suggestion to Dr. Stanton during our next session. She seemed pleased that I was taking the counseling seriously enough to consider medication, but she wanted to wait a few more weeks to see if the therapy techniques started working. Sometimes, she said, students became dependent on medication as a crutch instead of doing the hard work of therapy. She didn't want me to fall into that pattern. I was too tired to argue. Too tired to do anything except drag myself through each day, counting down hours until I could collapse back in my dorm room. My grades were in free fall. I'd failed 2 exams, hadn't turned in 3 major assignments, was on the verge of failing 2 of my 5 classes. My professors had started sending concerned emails asking if everything was okay, suggesting I come to office hours or seek academic support services. I couldn't bring myself to respond. What would I even say? That I was too sick to function but no one believed me? My parents called every Sunday like clockwork, and I lied to them. Told them everything was fine, classes were good, I was adjusting well. I didn't want them to worry, didn't want them to think I couldn't handle college. They'd been so proud when I got into Whitmore, had told all their friends about my scholarship, about how smart their son was. I couldn't admit that I was failing, that something was wrong with me and nobody could figure out what. Liam noticed something was wrong. Hard not to when your roommate is sleeping 16 hours a day and has lost 20 pounds. He asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, if he should call someone. I told him I was dealing with some health stuff, but I was seeing doctors and a counselor. It was under control. He seemed skeptical but didn't push. We weren't close enough for him to feel comfortable intervening, and part of me was grateful for that. I didn't want anyone seeing how bad things had gotten. Late October, I missed a session with Dr. Stanton because I physically couldn't get out of bed. I'd woken up with a headache so severe that light hurt, nausea so bad I couldn't keep down water, and this weird confusion where I couldn't remember what day it was or what I was supposed to be doing. I lay in bed for 6 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, until Liam came back from class and found me. He wanted to call an ambulance. I convinced him I just had the flu, needed to sleep it off. He made me promise to go to the health center the next day if I wasn't better. Dr. Stanton called my cell phone that evening, leaving a voicemail expressing concern that I'd missed our appointment without notice. She said she hoped I was okay and reminded me that consistency was important in therapy. Missing sessions could indicate avoidance behavior, a sign that the work we were doing was bringing up difficult emotions I wasn't ready to face. She hoped to see me at our regularly scheduled time next week. I listened to that voicemail 3 times, each time feeling more hopeless. She thought I'd skipped the session because I was avoiding therapy. She thought this was a psychological resistance, not a physical inability to move. How was I supposed to convince someone that I was genuinely sick when every symptom I reported was dismissed as anxiety? The next day, I dragged myself to the health center again, my 3rd visit in 6 weeks. This time, I saw Linda Okonkwo again, the original nurse practitioner. She remembered me, pulled up my chart, saw that I'd been back to see her colleague. She took one look at me, and her expression changed. I'd lost 23 pounds since my first visit. My skin had a grayish tint. I was shaking. She took my vitals, which showed elevated heart rate and slightly low blood pressure. She asked me to describe my symptoms again, listening more carefully this time. When I finished, she said she wanted to run more comprehensive blood work, metabolic panel, thyroid function, vitamin levels, inflammatory markers. She also wanted to do an EKG to check my heart, given the rapid heart rate. Something wasn't adding up, she said. Yes, anxiety could cause physical symptoms, but the degree of weight loss and the progression of symptoms over 6 weeks was concerning. She wanted to rule out other possibilities before concluding this was purely psychological. The blood work came back 2 days later. Everything was normal. Thyroid fine, metabolic panel fine, no vitamin deficiencies, no signs of infection or inflammation. The EKG was normal. Linda called me to go over the results, and I could hear the confusion in her voice. She'd been certain we'd find something, but we hadn't. Medically, I was completely healthy. She asked again about my mental health, whether I'd been compliant with counseling. I told her yes, I was seeing Dr. Stanton every week. Linda paused, then said something that stuck with me. Sometimes, she said, when we can't find a medical explanation for symptoms, it doesn't necessarily mean the symptoms are psychological. It just means we haven't found the right test yet. But given the resources available at a campus health center, she'd done all she could. She recommended I continue with counseling and consider seeing an outside physician if symptoms continued. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I should make sure my dorm room was well ventilated and that I wasn't being exposed to any environmental toxins. Sometimes mold or poor air quality could cause symptoms like mine. Had I noticed anything unusual about my room? I thought about it. The room was old. The heating system clanked a lot, but I hadn't noticed mold or any weird smells. I told her no, nothing unusual. She said okay, but to keep it in mind. I went to my session with Dr. Stanton the following Wednesday and told her about the new blood work, about Linda's suggestion to look for environmental causes. Dr. Stanton listened, then set down her pen with a small sigh. I could tell she was choosing her words carefully. She said she appreciated that the health center was being thorough, but at some point, we had to accept what the evidence was telling us. I'd had multiple rounds of blood work, all normal. An EKG, normal. A comprehensive physical exam, normal. Every medical test said I was healthy. The only explanation that fit the facts was that my symptoms were psychosomatic, driven by anxiety and stress. She continued, saying that sometimes patients became fixated on finding a physical cause because it was easier to accept than acknowledging psychological issues. There was still stigma around mental health, and some people would rather believe they had an undiagnosed disease than admit they were struggling emotionally. She wanted me to consider whether I was falling into that pattern. That was the first time she directly accused me of exaggerating or fabricating symptoms. She didn't use those words exactly, but the implication was clear. I was so invested in being physically sick that I was rejecting the obvious psychological explanation. I was, in her professional opinion, seeking attention through dramatic physical complaints, unable to accept that I just needed to work harder on managing my stress. I left that session feeling worse than I'd ever felt, not just physically sick, but emotionally gutted. The person who was supposed to be helping me thought I was making it up, thought I was being difficult, attention-seeking, resistant to treatment. I started to believe her. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I was so desperate for someone to take me seriously that I was inventing symptoms or exaggerating normal sensations. Maybe the headaches weren't that bad. Maybe the dizziness was just standing up too fast. Maybe I was just weak and pathetic and couldn't handle normal college life. November arrived, and I stopped going to most of my classes. I couldn't concentrate well enough to follow lectures, and the walk across campus exhausted me. I spent most of my time in my dorm room, in bed, sleeping or staring at the ceiling. I stopped eating in the dining hall, surviving on protein bars and crackers I kept in my desk drawer. I stopped showering regularly because the hot water made me dizzy and nauseous. I stopped answering my parents' calls because I couldn't keep lying to them and I couldn't tell them the truth. Liam started spending more time at his girlfriend's place. I didn't blame him. Who wanted to room with someone who was clearly falling apart? The RA on our floor, a junior named Austin Pryor, knocked on my door one evening in mid-November. He said some people had expressed concern about me, that I hadn't been seen around much, that I looked sick when people did see me. Was everything okay? Did I need help? If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I told him I was fine, just dealing with some health issues. He asked if I was getting medical care. I said yes, I was seeing a counselor. He seemed satisfied with that answer, told me if I needed anything to let him know, and left. Nobody came to check on me again. I had one final session with Dr. Stanton in mid-November. I'd missed the previous week's session again, too exhausted to make the walk to the Student Services building. When I showed up this time, she didn't seem pleased to see me. She asked why I'd missed last week. I said I'd been too sick to come. She made a note, then asked if I'd been taking any of the medication the health center prescribed. I said yes, though the ondansetron wasn't working anymore. Nothing was working. She asked if I'd been doing my therapy homework, the thought journals and the breathing exercises. I admitted I hadn't. I didn't have the energy. She set down her pen and looked at me with what I can only describe as frustration. She said we needed to have an honest conversation about my commitment to treatment. Therapy only worked if the patient was willing to put in effort. Missing sessions, not doing homework, these were signs that I wasn't taking the process seriously. I wasn't giving therapy a real chance to work. Furthermore, she said, there was a pattern she was seeing in my behavior that concerned her. The escalating physical complaints despite normal medical tests. The resistance to psychological explanations. The dramatic presentations of symptoms. The missed appointments followed by claims of being too sick to attend. This pattern was consistent with what's called factitious disorder, or in more severe cases, Munchausen syndrome, where patients fabricate or exaggerate illness to receive attention and care. I sat there, stunned. She was saying I had Munchausen syndrome, that I was making myself sick on purpose for attention. I tried to protest, to explain that I wasn't making anything up, that I genuinely felt awful every single day, but she held up a hand to stop me. She said she wasn't diagnosing me with factitious disorder, not officially, but she wanted me to seriously consider whether I was getting some kind of psychological benefit from being sick. Was I avoiding responsibilities by claiming illness? Was I receiving sympathy and attention that I wasn't getting otherwise? Was there something appealing about being taken care of, about being a patient, that made me unconsciously perpetuate my symptoms? She recommended I consider taking a medical leave from school to focus on intensive outpatient therapy, possibly even an inpatient program, if my symptoms were as severe as I claimed. The university had resources for students who needed mental health support, but I needed to be honest with myself and with her about what was really going on. I walked out of that session knowing I was done. I wasn't going back to counseling. If the professional whose job was to help me thought I was faking everything, what was the point? I was on my own. I went back to my dorm room and didn't leave for 3 days. Liam was gone for the weekend, staying at his girlfriend's. I slept most of the time, waking up disoriented and confused, my head pounding, my stomach churning. On the 3rd day, I woke up around noon and tried to sit up. The room spun violently and I fell back onto my bed, my vision tunneling. I tried again, moving slower this time, and managed to get to my feet. I needed water, needed food, needed to take a shower and maybe do some laundry because I'd been wearing the same clothes for a week. I made it 3 steps toward the door before my legs gave out. I collapsed onto the floor, cracking my head against the corner of my desk on the way down. Pain exploded through my skull, bright and sharp, and then everything went soft and distant. I lay there on the floor, unable to move, unable to think clearly, knowing something was very wrong but unable to do anything about it. The room was spinning even though I was lying still. My heart was racing but also felt weak, fluttery. I couldn't catch my breath. I needed help, but my phone was on my desk and I couldn't reach it. I tried to call out, but my voice came out as a whisper. I don't remember much after that. There are flashes, disconnected moments, the door opening, someone shouting my name, hands on me, rolling me over, bright lights, sirens, the oxygen mask, voices I didn't recognize talking about carbon monoxide and ventilation and carboxyhemoglobin levels. Then nothing for a while. Then waking up in the hospital with my mother crying and a nurse telling me I'd been poisoned. According to the incident report I read later, Liam had come back to the room around 6 p.m. on that 3rd day and found me unconscious on the floor. He'd called 911 immediately. The paramedics who responded noticed the radiator in the room was putting out heat, but also a faint smell they couldn't quite identify. One of them, a veteran EMT named Daniel Foster with 18 years of experience, had a hunch and asked dispatch to send the fire department with a carbon monoxide detector. The fire department arrived and tested the room. The carbon monoxide levels were at 200 parts per million. Anything above 70 parts per million is considered immediately dangerous to life. I'd been breathing poisoned air for months. The faulty radiator in my dorm room had been leaking carbon monoxide since August, slowly poisoning me since the day I moved in. The radiator's heat exchanger had a crack in it, allowing combustion gases to vent into the room instead of being properly exhausted outside. Every time the heating system kicked on, which was constantly as the weather got colder, it pumped more carbon monoxide into the air. Because the dorm was old and the room was small and I kept the door closed for privacy, the gas had accumulated to dangerous levels. Liam had been fine because he was rarely in the room. He spent most of his time at class or with his girlfriend, only sleeping in the dorm a few nights a week. He'd been exposed to the carbon monoxide too, but not nearly as much as I had. I'd been living in that room, breathing that poison, for 3 months. Every symptom I'd reported had been textbook carbon monoxide poisoning. The headaches, the nausea, the fatigue, the confusion, the difficulty concentrating, the dizziness, all of it. And Dr. Beverly Stanton had diagnosed me with anxiety and accused me of having Munchausen syndrome. The hospital kept me for 4 days, pumping oxygen into my lungs to flush out the carbon monoxide, running tests to check for organ damage. Dr. Rashid Ahmadi, the attending physician in the ICU where I was initially treated, explained that I was incredibly lucky to be alive. At the levels I'd been exposed to, many people suffered permanent brain damage or died. I'd been found just in time. The crack of my head against the desk had left a nasty gash that required 12 stitches, but that injury had probably saved my life. If I'd made it to bed and fallen asleep instead of collapsing on the floor where Liam could see me, I likely wouldn't have woken up. Dr. Ahmadi was furious when he heard I'd been seeing a campus counselor for months reporting these exact symptoms and had been told it was anxiety. He made detailed notes in my chart about the counseling I'd received, the diagnoses I'd been given, the dismissal of my physical complaints. He said he'd be reporting this to the university's administration and strongly recommended my parents contact a lawyer. My parents arrived the morning after I was admitted, having driven through the night when the hospital called them. My mom was a mess, crying and hugging me and asking why I hadn't told them how bad things had gotten. My dad was quiet, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes hard. When Dr. Amadi explained about the carbon monoxide, about how I'd been slowly poisoned for months while being told it was all in my head. My dad's expression turned to something cold and dangerous. He asked Dr. Amadi for copies of all my medical records. He asked for the fire department's report on the carbon monoxide levels. He asked for the names of everyone I'd seen at the campus health center and the counseling center. Dr. Amadi provided everything. The university's response was swift, at least publicly. Dean Leopold Finch, the dean of student affairs who'd been in his position for 9 years, came to the hospital personally to apologize and assure my parents that the university was taking this matter extremely seriously. A full investigation was being launched. All dormitories were being tested for carbon monoxide immediately. The students in the rooms adjacent to mine had been moved as a precaution, and those rooms were being tested as well. The university was committed to student safety and deeply regretted that I'd been harmed while in their care. It all sounded very official and concerned, but my dad wasn't buying it. He asked Dean Finch point blank when the radiators in Marshall Hall had last been inspected. Finch said he'd have to check the maintenance records and get back to us. He asked if any other students had reported similar symptoms. Finch said he wasn't aware of any, but would look into it. He asked what the university planned to do about the counselor who'd dismissed my symptoms for months. Finch said that was a personnel matter he couldn't discuss, but assured us it would be handled appropriately. My dad asked if handled appropriately meant Dr. Stanton would be fired. Finch said he couldn't comment on specific personnel actions, but that any employee who failed to meet professional standards would face consequences. My dad told him to get out. We'd be hearing from our lawyer. The university's lawyer called the next day. Her name was Catherine Ung, and she'd been the university's general counsel for 6 years, handling everything from contract disputes to liability cases. She was professional, sympathetic, and clearly trying to gauge whether we were planning to sue. She reiterated the university's commitment to my well-being and mentioned that they'd be happy to cover all my medical expenses and provide additional support as I recovered. My dad, who'd already consulted with a personal injury attorney back home, told her we'd be in touch through our legal representation and to direct all future communication through them. Catherine Ung gave him her contact information and wished me a full recovery. The maintenance records Dean Finch promised to check came back revealing something damning. The radiators in Marshall Hall were supposed to be inspected annually. The last inspection had been in 2019. It was now 2023. The radiators hadn't been inspected in 4 years, a clear violation of both university policy and state building codes. Furthermore, the maintenance department had received 3 work orders in the past year from students in Marshall Hall complaining about strange smells or headaches, but the work orders had been marked as completed with notes saying the radiators were functioning normally and no issues were found. Nobody had actually tested for carbon monoxide. The university tried to keep all of this quiet, but the story leaked. The campus newspaper, run by journalism students who took their jobs seriously, got wind of the carbon monoxide poisoning and started digging. They filed Freedom of Information requests for maintenance records. They interviewed students in Marshall Hall. They found 2 other students who'd been experiencing similar symptoms to mine and had been told by campus health services that they had anxiety. One of them, a sophomore named Isabel Reyes, had been hospitalized the previous semester for what doctors thought was a panic attack severe enough to cause hyperventilation and fainting. She'd been living in the room directly above mine. Her symptoms had stopped when she moved to a different dorm in January. Nobody had made the connection. The newspaper published their findings in early December. University maintenance failures lead to student poisoning. Multiple cases ignored. Administration knew of risks. The article detailed everything: the lack of inspections, the ignored work orders, my 3 months of deteriorating health while being dismissed by campus counseling, Isabel's hospitalization, the university's attempts to quietly settle. The story went viral on social media. Parents were outraged, students were scared. The local news picked it up, then regional news, then national outlets. Whitmore University's carbon monoxide scandal became a cautionary tale about institutional negligence and the failure to take student health concerns seriously. Dr. Beverly Stanton was placed on immediate administrative leave pending an investigation by the university and by the state licensing board for professional counselors. The investigation revealed a pattern that made me realize I wasn't alone in being dismissed by her. Her case files, subpoenaed as part of the university's internal investigation, showed she'd diagnosed dozens of students with anxiety or adjustment disorder over the past 5 years, often after minimal assessment. Several students had reported physical symptoms that were later found to have medical causes, diabetes, thyroid disorders, autoimmune conditions, but only after they'd sought outside medical care. Stanton had consistently attributed physical complaints to psychological issues, even when students specifically reported that counseling wasn't helping and symptoms were worsening. Her notes on my case were particularly damning. She'd documented my weight loss, my reported headaches, my descriptions of severe fatigue, but she'd framed all of it as evidence of my anxiety and resistance to treatment. In her final session notes, she'd written that I displayed attention-seeking behavior consistent with possible factitious disorder, and that I was overly focused on physical symptoms despite lack of medical findings. Those notes had been written 2 weeks before I was found unconscious, dying of carbon monoxide poisoning. The state licensing board moved faster than I expected. They held a hearing in January to determine whether Stanton's license should be suspended or revoked. My parents attended, though I was still recovering and didn't want to face her in person. The attorney representing the licensing board laid out the case methodically. Dr. Stanton had a duty to provide competent care. She'd breached that duty by failing to consider medical causes for my symptoms, by diagnosing me with anxiety and later suggesting factitious disorder without adequate assessment, and by discouraging me from seeking additional medical evaluation. Her failure to properly assess and treat me had resulted in serious harm. I'd continued to deteriorate under her care, while she attributed my worsening symptoms to psychological resistance and attention-seeking. Most damning was her suggestion that I had Munchausen syndrome based solely on the fact that I wasn't responding to therapy and kept reporting physical symptoms. The board's expert witness, a psychologist named Dr. Monica Tran, with 25 years of experience and specialization in college mental health, testified that Dr. Stanton's treatment fell far below the standard of care. When a patient reports persistent physical symptoms that worsen over time despite therapy, the appropriate response is to refer back to medical professionals for further evaluation, not to accuse the patient of fabricating illness. Dr. Tran noted that carbon monoxide poisoning mimics anxiety almost perfectly, which is exactly why mental health professionals need to maintain a healthy skepticism about purely psychological diagnoses when physical symptoms are prominent. She stated that any competent counselor should have recognized the red flags in my case: sudden onset of symptoms after starting college, progressive worsening despite appropriate therapy, significant weight loss, symptoms that interfered with basic functioning. These should have prompted referral for more comprehensive medical workup, possibly including environmental assessment of the dorm room, not accusations of attention-seeking. Dr. Stanton's defense was weak. Her attorney argued that she'd acted in good faith based on the information available, that the campus health center had cleared me medically multiple times, and that she couldn't have known about the carbon monoxide leak. The board wasn't sympathetic. The chair pointed out that Stanton's own notes showed she'd discouraged me from seeking additional medical evaluation, that she'd attributed my deterioration to psychological resistance rather than considering alternative explanations. The board deliberated for 2 hours before returning with their decision. License revoked, effective immediately. Dr. Stanton could petition for reinstatement in 5 years, but she'd have to complete extensive continuing education on medical psychological interfaces and demonstrate competence before being allowed to practice again. She'd also be required to disclose the revocation to any future employers or licensing boards. Her career in college counseling was over. The civil lawsuit my parents filed moved forward in parallel. Our attorney, a medical malpractice specialist named Gregory Abbott, who'd been practicing for 30 years, filed suit against Dr. Beverly Stanton individually, against the university for negligent maintenance and failure to provide safe housing, and against the counseling center for inadequate supervision and training. The complaint detailed everything: the faulty radiator, the missed inspections, the ignored work orders, my months of suffering, Stanton's negligent treatment, the university's knowledge of maintenance problems. We sought damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, educational losses, and punitive damages for the university's willful neglect. The university fought at first, their lawyers filing motions to dismiss and arguing that they couldn't be held responsible for what they framed as an unfortunate accident. But as discovery proceeded and more evidence emerged about the maintenance failures, about the multiple ignored complaints, about the administration's decision to defer inspections to save money, their position became untenable. The depositions were brutal. The maintenance supervisor admitted under oath that he'd known the radiators were overdue for inspection, but had been told by his superiors to prioritize other projects because of budget constraints. Dean Finch admitted that student safety concerns about Marshall Hall had been raised in administrative meetings, but had been tabled pending a planned renovation that had been delayed multiple times. Catherine Ung, the university counsel, admitted that the university's insurance company had warned them years ago that deferred maintenance created liability exposure, but those warnings had been ignored. Dr. Stanton's deposition was the one I watched via video recording, still not ready to see her in person. She looked smaller than I remembered, older, worn down. When asked about her treatment decisions in my case, she stuck to her defense that she'd acted appropriately based on the information she had. When confronted with her notes suggesting I had factitious disorder, she claimed she'd never definitively diagnosed me with that, only mentioned it as something to consider. When asked why she'd discouraged me from seeking additional medical evaluation, she said she'd never discouraged me. She'd simply suggested we continue with therapy. The attorney played back audio from one of our sessions. I hadn't known the counseling center recorded sessions for training purposes, but they did, with signed consent forms I'd agreed to without reading carefully. In the recording, my voice sounded weak and desperate as I described my worsening symptoms and asked if I should go back to the health center. Stanton's voice was clear and firm as she responded that I'd already been medically cleared multiple times and that continued doctor shopping was a form of avoidance, a way to escape the psychological work we were doing. She said I needed to trust the therapeutic process instead of looking for medical explanations that didn't exist. Listening to that recording, hearing the dismissal in her voice, the certainty that she knew better than I did about my own body, made me angry in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be before. I'd spent so much time believing she was right, that I was crazy or weak or attention-seeking, hearing proof that she'd actively discouraged me from getting help, that she'd trapped me in a therapeutic relationship while I deteriorated, crystallized something inside me. She'd been wrong, catastrophically, dangerously wrong, and she'd been so sure of herself that she hadn't questioned her assumptions even as I got sicker and sicker right in front of her. The university settled in March for $4.2 million. The settlement included full payment of all medical expenses, compensation for lost educational opportunities, pain and suffering, and punitive damages. It also included a non-monetary component. The university agreed to implement comprehensive changes to their maintenance protocols, install carbon monoxide detectors in all dormitories, provide mandatory training for counseling center staff on medical psychological differentials, and establish an independent student safety oversight committee with authority to investigate health concerns. Dr. Stanton settled separately for her insurance policy limits of $1 million. Between the two settlements, my parents set up a trust that would cover my future medical care, my education, and still leave me with financial security for life. The money didn't make up for what happened, but it meant I wouldn't have to worry about paying for the ongoing treatment I needed. The carbon monoxide exposure had left me with some permanent effects. My neurologist, Dr. Simone Carver, who specialized in toxic exposures and had been treating me since my release from the hospital, explained that chronic carbon monoxide poisoning could cause lasting cognitive and neurological damage. I had persistent memory issues, difficulty with concentration that was worse than before, and occasional balance problems. I also developed depression and anxiety, the real kind, from the trauma of being gaslit and medically neglected for months. The irony wasn't lost on me that I now actually needed the mental health treatment that Stanton had been providing for the wrong reasons. I found a good therapist in private practice, someone who believed me when I talked about my experiences and helped me process the betrayal and medical trauma. I took a medical leave from Whitmore for the spring semester to focus on recovery. I never went back. The campus held too many bad memories, and I'd lost any trust I had in the institution. I transferred to a different university closer to home for the following fall, starting fresh with a new major. I'd planned to study computer science, but my experience changed what I wanted to do with my life. I'm studying environmental health now, focusing on indoor air quality and toxic exposure prevention. I want to help identify and prevent the kind of poisoning that nearly killed me, to protect other people who might not recognize what's happening to them. I'm also involved in advocacy work around patient rights and medical gaslighting, speaking to student groups and medical professionals about the importance of listening to patients and considering environmental factors in mysterious illnesses. Dr. Beverly Stanton never worked in counseling again. I heard through the legal grapevine that she tried to get a job as a life coach, which doesn't require a license, but her revocation was publicly searchable, and potential clients would find it when they Googled her name. Eventually, she moved out of state, and I stopped keeping track of her. I don't waste energy on hatred anymore. What she did was wrong, and she faced consequences. That has to be enough. Whitmore University underwent significant reforms after the scandal. The president resigned under pressure from the board of trustees. The maintenance department was completely restructured with new leadership and mandatory safety protocols. The counseling center implemented new assessment procedures and supervision requirements. None of it brought back the 3 months of my life I lost to carbon monoxide poisoning, or the innocence I lost believing that authority figures would help me when I asked for help. But maybe it protected the students who came after me. I'm 21 now, about to graduate with my bachelor's degree. My memory issues mean I have to work harder than other students, take better notes, record lectures, build in extra study time. My depression and anxiety are managed with medication and therapy. I have regular checkups with my neurologist to monitor for any progression of symptoms. I'm applying to graduate programs in environmental health, planning to continue this work professionally. The settlement money is still there, carefully invested. A safety net I hope I'll never need, but I'm grateful to have. My parents and I are closer than we were before. They blame themselves for not knowing how sick I was, for trusting the university to keep me safe. I've forgiven them. How could they have known? I was telling them I was fine, and they believed me the same way I believed Dr. Stanton when she said I was anxious. We all want to trust the systems that are supposed to protect us. The hardest part of recovery has been learning to trust my own perception again. For months, I believed I was crazy, that my body was lying to me, that the symptoms I felt weren't real. Having a professional tell you that your reality is false, that you're making things up or exaggerating, it gets inside your head. Even now, when I feel sick, there's a voice that whispers, maybe it's nothing, maybe you're overreacting, maybe you're being dramatic. I have to consciously push back against that voice, remind myself that I have the right to assess my own experience, that seeking medical care isn't weakness or attention-seeking. The carbon monoxide detector in my apartment has never gone off, but I check it compulsively anyway. I open windows even in winter, paranoid about air quality. I see my therapist weekly. These are the invisible scars, the ways trauma reshapes you even after the physical danger has passed. But I'm alive. That's what matters. I'm alive, and I'm using my experience to help others, and the people who failed me faced real consequences. Dr. Stanton lost her license. The university paid millions and reformed their systems. Dean Finch was quietly pushed out. The maintenance supervisor was fired. Justice isn't always satisfying, and it doesn't erase what happened, but it's something. It's proof that I was right to trust my body, right to believe something was wrong, right to feel betrayed when the people who should have helped me didn't. I was found unconscious in my dorm room, poisoned by carbon monoxide, while my counselor insisted I was just seeking attention. She was wrong, and everyone knows it now. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.